You don't feel too much, you feel what others can't. And that places you among the 1% who see the world from the inside, not the outside. There are people who move through life brushing past their days. And then there's you, someone who notices tiny shifts, hidden tones, silent pains that no one else seems to catch. Maybe you've spent years thinking you were too sensitive, too intense, too deep. But the truth is different. You've always had a perception that rises above the surface, an intuition that arrives before logic, a consciousness that sees what lives in the shadows, not just what's visible. And that's exactly what this video is about. Today you'll clearly understand the signs that show you belong to a rare group, those who feel the world with genuine depth. And more than that, you'll discover how to transform this sensitivity into strength, clarity, and direction. If you've ever felt different without knowing why, in the next few seconds, everything will start to make sense. He always sensed there was something different about the way he moved through the world, as if he noticed tiny cracks in everyday life that others ignored without a second thought. While most people were distracted by the external noise, he felt a silent calling rising from within, almost like a whisper only the most awakened intuition could hear. That depth felt like it came from a hidden place deep in the unconscious, where shadow and essence meet. Sometimes he even tried to fit into the pace of the people around him, but quickly realized his sensitivity didn't fit inside narrow frames. It was like noticing an invisible truth floating between empty conversations, begging to be seen. And no matter how hard he tried to pretend he didn't feel so much, his consciousness insisted, steady. Something in him knew that perceiving what hasn't been said is more a destiny than a choice. With time, he realized this ability wasn't mystical. It was simply the gift of capturing subtleties that escaped less attentive eyes. A shift in tone, a quick glance, a hesitant gesture, all of it said more than long speeches. He felt other people's pain before they shared a single word, like someone reading a book by its cover but understanding the entire story. This created an immediate connection to the world, even when it hurt. His sensitivity felt like a silent radar, picking up emotions floating through the air, and even when he tried to ignore this quiet gift, it reappeared, persistent, as if life itself were calling him to see deeper, farther beyond the surface. He was the type of person who walked into a room and instantly sensed a hidden tension, a strange energy, an unspoken intention. While others would just say, "Something feels off," he knew exactly what was out of place, even without any concrete proof. It was intuition revealing itself before logic had time to arrive. In quick conversations, he picked up on micro-expressions that betrayed guarded truths, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a compliment lacking real empathy, a pause a little too long to be natural. Nothing escaped someone who sees with the soul. And ironically, that often made him seem distant, when in reality he simply saw too much. Maybe because essence always speaks louder than appearance. Even as a child, he questioned things no one else around him seemed to notice. He sensed when an adult was sad, even if they were smiling. He felt when a friend was scared, even when they insisted they were fine. This ability to see hidden truths grew with him, and the more he dove into himself, the clearer it became. It's interesting how something so silent can carry so much weight. Sometimes a single tiny detail was enough for him to understand an entire story. A sigh, averted eyes, a long silence. He didn't search for these perceptions, they simply arrived, as if the unconscious handed him ready-made answers before he even formed questions. And so, carrying this rare sensitivity, he learned that being awake in a world that sleeps isn't simple. Seeing too much is both a blessing and a burden. Because perceiving truth, even the truth no one wants to admit, demands courage. It demands consciousness. It demands depth. And he understood that beneath this silent calling, something even greater was waiting to be revealed. Something only those who feel beyond the surface are able to reach. He learned early on that pain isn't an enemy. It's a messenger. While so many run from it as if running from their own shadow, he carried a quiet courage to look discomfort directly in the eye, even when it required more sensitivity than brute strength. Pain, for him, was never just an inconvenience. It was a sign, a request from the unconscious asking him to return to his essence. And every time he faced this feeling without flinching, he discovered that the truth behind it was always more freeing than frightening. Deep down, he knew that only those who allow themselves to feel can grow, and to feel deeply. With time, he realized that every wound carried an invisible map, pointing toward parts of himself he still needed to understand. It wasn't about suffering. It was about listening. The depth of this process took him into inner places most people avoid, out of fear of confronting something they don't want to admit. But he understood that consciousness expands precisely when we walk through these unfamiliar territories. It felt like walking down a dark hallway, and instead of fearing it, realizing that the answers logic could never provide were hidden there. And in a strange way, there was even beauty in that descent. Sometimes he caught himself smiling when remembering difficult moments, not because they were good, but because they revealed things he would never have seen if he had stayed numb like so many around him. He remembered, for example, a phase where everything seemed to crumble. Unstable work, relationships falling apart, a constant sense of emptiness. And it was precisely during that phase that he began writing, transforming pain into consciousness, shadow into intuition. The funny thing is, the more he accepted that vulnerability, the stronger he became, as if life rewarded those who stopped running. He also learned that other people's pain affected him just as deeply as his own. When a friend was hurting, he didn't offer rehearsed phrases, he offered presence. He knew pain doesn't want to be erased, it wants to be understood. And this profound, almost visceral empathy connected him to people in a rare way. He noticed nuances others overlooked, exhaustion behind an "I'm fine," fear hidden inside exaggerated laughter, truth dripping through long silences, and little by little he realized his gift wasn't feeling too much, it was feeling enough to see beyond. In the end, even though he knew pain could exhaust him, he understood that it always opened doors joy could never open alone. It was as if each internal scar illuminated another part of the path, calling him to a new level of consciousness that was still unfolding. And he sensed, even without saying it aloud, that something greater was approaching, something that didn't rely on logic but on an even deeper perception. One that intuition would soon reveal. He always noticed that certain understandings simply appeared inside him, as if they came from a place where the unconscious had already done the work before the mind woke up. While many needed evidence, he only needed to feel truth settling in his chest. That sensation that arrived before any rational thought. It was as if intuition were always one step ahead, guiding him with a depth no logical explanation could match. And even if it seemed strange to others, to him it felt natural, almost familiar. After all, consciousness moves in mysterious ways, and he had already learned to trust that movement. Sometimes it was something simple, choosing a different route home for no apparent reason, just because something inside him whispered, "Don't go that way." Other times it was more complex, like realizing someone wasn't telling the truth, even when the smile seemed convincing. He felt the shadow behind overly careful behavior, sensed the real essence slipping through the cracks, and whenever he tried to ignore that silent warning, something went wrong. Over time, he learned to listen to this inner radar, not as superstition, but as a sign of sharpened sensitivity. Intuition rarely fails. It's the world that tries to silence it. Many around him thought he overthought things, when in reality he hadn't even started thinking. He simply knew. The mind came later, trying to organize what the heart had already understood. It was funny to see how surprised people were by his accuracy, as if it were luck, coincidence, or some improbable talent. But he knew none of it was magic. It was the unconscious working quietly, gathering clues logic could never reach. And the more he trusted that flow, the clearer it became. Truth arrives first in feeling, not thinking. In practical situations, this perception saved him countless times. When he was about to accept a job that seemed perfect, something inside him grew heavy. That feeling that the energy didn't match, that there was pain disguised behind pretty promises. He refused, even without concrete arguments. Months later, he learned the environment was toxic. In relationships, this sensitivity was even stronger. He sensed emotional distance before the other person admitted it. And although that hurt sometimes, it gave him the chance to act with empathy and truth, instead of pretending nothing was happening. With time, he realized that living guided by intuition is like walking with a flashlight that illuminates a few meters ahead. Never everything, but always enough to keep going. And this awareness shaped his way of existing, opening doors others didn't even notice were there. It was as if every insight were an invitation to look deeper, more consciously, more in tune with his own essence. And he sensed, without saying it, that there was a price for seeing ahead, a weight that was beginning to reveal itself, preparing the path for what came next. Seeing too much was always an ambiguous gift in his life, one of those blessings that illuminate and wound at the same time. While many only notice what's on the surface, he picked up on nuances so subtle they felt like whispers of someone's hidden essence. Truth always revealed itself to him, even when no one wanted to acknowledge it, and that carried a silent weight, because noticing intentions and emotions that others overlook is never as simple as it seems. Sometimes he wished he didn't notice so much, didn't feel so deeply, but consciousness doesn't move backwards. Once you see, you can't unsee. He knew when someone was lying, even if their tone was perfectly convincing. He felt the shadow behind polite gestures, sensed heavy energy entering a room long before anyone else noticed. His sensitivity captured everything: the glance that wandered, the pause that stretched a little too long, the strained breath before a sentence. And this ability, though profound, was exhausting. It's hard to carry truths others ignore. It's strange to feel pains that aren't yours. It's heavy to watch fragile masks barely holding together, even when the person is desperate to keep them intact. In practical moments, this was even more obvious. He could predict conflicts no one saw coming, like during family gatherings where everyone smiled, but he felt tension spreading through the room. He knew something buried was about to explode, and intuition always confirmed it later. At work, he could tell when someone was about to sabotage him long before any concrete sign appeared. And ironically, this made him a constant observer, the one who saw the entire board while everyone else stared at a single piece. But perhaps the hardest part was sensing the emotional truth of people he loved, noticing hidden sadness, masked fear, suppressed pain. It was like feeling each fragment of their emotions seep into his own chest. And even so, he kept offering empathy, because he knew many lacked the courage to admit what they felt. At the same time, the weight of such sensitivity made him carry more than he should. So sometimes he wondered whether seeing too much was really a gift, or an open wound that never fully heals. Still, even while carrying that burden, he understood that such heightened consciousness led him to places few people ever reach. Seeing too much left him exhausted, but it also made him more truthful with himself, and woven through that realization was an understanding that feeling the world this way wasn't just a weight, it was also a bridge that would soon carry him into another level of empathy, the kind that hurts but transforms, and that was about to unfold with even more intensity. He always felt the world with an intensity that few people could truly understand. When someone around him was suffering, he didn't just notice, he absorbed it. It was as if another person's pain slipped into him, touching deep layers of his own essence. This rare empathy allowed him to see nuances most people ignored, recognizing the emotional shadow hidden inside simple gestures. Sometimes all it took was one look at someone to know something wasn't right. That sensitivity, though beautiful, carried a weight that was hard to explain. After all, feeling beyond the surface can be as deep as it is exhausting. In the most intense moments, he sensed energies that no one else mentioned. He'd walk into a room and immediately know who was sad, who was scared, who was pretending to be strong. It was as if his unconscious acted like an invisible antenna, picking up vibrations that didn't need words. This made him a comforting presence and simultaneously a vulnerable one. Because while he helped others carry their pain, he often forgot to tend to his own. His empathy wasn't selective. It reached everything, even what he wished he couldn't feel. In practical situations, this showed up in curious and painful ways. For example, when a friend tried to hide their suffering behind an easy smile, he felt the real weight beneath it. When someone said, "I'm okay," but avoided eye contact, he knew something was wrong. Even in a grocery store line, he sensed the anxiety of the person behind him, as if their heartbeat were pulsing too close to his own. And without thinking, he offered kindness, a gentle word, a soft gesture, a spark of awareness that eased the tension. That sensitivity was almost an automatic reflex. But the hardest part of such deep empathy is that it doesn't come with an off switch. He carried pains that weren't his, emotions he only witnessed but still felt. It was sacred territory and at the same time delicate enough to require careful steps. Silently, he tried to filter everything he absorbed, protecting himself from drowning in other people's emotions. The line between feeling with someone and feeling for someone was always thin, and still he kept showing up with presence because he knew this gift wasn't weakness. It was truth. Over time, this empathy that hurt began showing him the importance of space and emotional protection. Feeling so much required rest, introspection, distance. He understood more and more that he needed solitude to return to himself, to cleanse the energies he collected, and to restore his own consciousness. And woven through that understanding, he started noticing the next step of his journey, learning to step back without losing himself, to create the distance necessary to survive emotionally, even while continuing to feel deeply. He discovered over time that the deeper his consciousness grew, the harder it became to stay in places that were too loud. It wasn't pettiness or escape. It was emotional survival. The sensitivity he carried, that ability to feel energies and unspoken truths, needed room to breathe. When he spent too much time surrounded by noise, his essence felt lost in the clutter. And so he pulled away quietly, like someone returning to their own shadow for balance. Distance, for him, was a refuge. It wasn't uncommon for people to confuse this withdrawal with coldness, but those who see the world with such depth know that retreat is a form of preservation. He picked up hidden pain, subtle tension, disguised intentions, and all of it layered inside him like heavy energy. He needed moments of pause to reorganize the unconscious, to separate what belonged to him and what was merely absorbed from others. Solitude in those moments didn't hurt. It rebuilt him. It was the only place where his sensitivity could rest uninterrupted. In everyday situations, this showed up in simple ways. He avoided overly crowded parties, preferred deep conversations to noisy gatherings, and chose to walk alone when he needed clarity. If he sensed the energy in a place shifting, he'd step away before the weight of the environment hit him fully. There were moments when he sat with friends, felt the atmosphere change, and quietly got up to breathe outside. It wasn't about being antisocial. It was about protecting his truth. He knew that if he didn't guard this inner space, he'd end up drowning in other people's intensity. Curiously, this distance never made him feel disconnected from the world. In fact, when he returned, he came back more conscious, more whole, more able to offer genuine empathy. It was as if silence amplified his intuition, clearing the noise that clouded his perception. In solitude, he found his own light and, at the same time, recognized his shadows with honesty. That pause allowed him to move among people again without carrying the excess weight of their emotions. It was a delicate balance, but an essential one. And deep down, he knew this need to withdraw had an even deeper reason. The more he felt, the less he tolerated anything superficial. Distance prepared him to recognize, even more clearly, what nourished his soul and what drained his consciousness. And without realizing it, this quiet movement was guiding him to the next step, understanding why he could never stand anything shallow. He always felt that shallow conversations left him restless, like someone trying to drink water from a dry fountain. For someone with so much depth, empty words felt like noise that nourished nothing inside. While some people were satisfied with quick exchanges and automatic gestures, he needed substance, real stories, genuine feelings, thoughts that dove into the unconscious. His sensitivity didn't match with triviality. It was like trying to fit an expanded soul into a space far too small. And without realizing it, this refusal of the superficial shaped all his relationships. In many moments, he tried to adapt, join in typical conversations, smile at the expected spots. But soon his consciousness drifted away as if saying, "There's no truth here," not because he felt superior, but because his essence demanded authenticity. He wanted to understand where people's pain came from, what moved them, what they carried in the shadow. He wanted to hear stories that revealed what lived between the lines, and when that didn't happen, his spirit seemed to dim, like a plant starved of light. In everyday life, this was obvious. He avoided forced interactions, choosing a few deep friendships over large social circles. In gatherings where everyone talked without listening, he sensed the stagnant energy and felt the urge to leave. But when someone spoke about something meaningful, his empathy lit up. He asked questions that went beyond the obvious, touching the other person's unconscious. And strangely, people opened up to him in ways they couldn't with anyone else. It was as if his depth gave their essence permission to appear. With time, he realized this refusal of the superficial wasn't a limitation. It was a filter that protected him from draining situations and brought him closer to what truly mattered. He sought conversations that sparked consciousness, connections that nourished the spirit, spaces where he could breathe without feeling he was wasting his sensitivity. It pushed some people away, yes, but it drew in those who truly matched his inner truth. And in the end, that was what mattered, living aligned with what he genuinely felt. And he began to notice that this deep gaze wasn't limited to conversations. He observed everything before taking action: people, movements, intentions, patterns. It was as if he were always seeing the full picture, while the world saw only fragments. And woven through that perception came the next part of his journey, realizing he wasn't just someone who sought depth. He was also the invisible observer of everything around him. He always had this curious ability to be present without drawing attention, as if he occupied space and simultaneously observed it from outside. While the world spoke loudly, he noticed silent details, subtle movements, shifts in energy, small tensions hiding in the air. The depth with which he saw things made him a privileged spectator. It was as if he existed in two places at once, on the stage with everyone else, and in the audience, analyzing every gesture and shadow. This double consciousness was powerful, but demanding. After all, seeing so much never comes without cost. At social gatherings, this became even more obvious. While people talked without filtering anything, he picked up on inner patterns, everything no one dared to verbalize. He noticed when someone altered their tone to hide insecurity, when another exaggerated their laughter to mask pain, when someone looked away to avoid confronting their own truth. His intuition acted like an inner lighthouse, lighting up the unconscious of others before they even noticed. And that made him a silent observer, someone who understood the emotional fabric of a situation long before it unraveled. In practical situations, this ability felt like a discrete superpower. In work meetings, he knew who was uncomfortable, who was trying to manipulate the environment, who carried hidden intentions. He observed the whole game while everyone else focused on a single move. In personal relationships, this heightened awareness only intensified. He sensed the truth living between the lines, the essence no one admitted, yet he felt it even at a distance, and even when he remained quiet, his gaze said what he knew, far more than he ever voiced. But this deep observation came with an invisible exhaustion. He carried information he never asked for, perceptions he never chose to have. Sometimes he wished he could be like others, simply living without analyzing everything. He wanted to turn off the internal radar, stop sensing the shadow behind intentions, the pain inside silences. But his consciousness wouldn't allow it. He was born to see what escapes common eyes. And despite the weight, he understood that this sensitivity connected him to the world in a rare way, even if the world barely noticed his presence. With time, he began to accept that being an invisible observer had a greater purpose. Seeing patterns, understanding intentions, and recognizing hidden truths prepared him for something even deeper, facing his own inner universe. Because by seeing so much outside, he inevitably began seeing more inside. And there, in the silent space between light and shadow, he found his greatest strength and his greatest conflict, a conflict that was approaching, the one between the light he carried and the shadows he knew intimately. He always carried within himself a territory that few people have the courage to explore, the space where light and shadow meet. While many avoid looking into their own unconscious, he knew that part of his depth came precisely from facing what goes unsaid, what most people prefer to hide from themselves. In that silent confrontation, he discovered his truth. Acknowledging his own shadows didn't scare him, it strengthened him. It was like opening an inner door and realizing that pain, sensitivity, and consciousness weave together to reveal his most real essence. From early on, he understood that denying the shadow is like erasing half of your own story. Light only becomes clear when you know where it comes from. And for him, this understanding was never theoretical. It was lived. When he noticed an impulsive reaction, unexpected anger, or a deep fear rising, he didn't run. Instead, he investigated. He asked himself, "What is this trying to tell me?" That willingness placed him on another level of self-knowledge, where intuition guided the way and every emotion was a clue, not a threat. Few people have the courage to feel that deeply. In practical situations, this inner conflict showed up when he reacted more intensely than necessary. Instead of blaming himself, he understood that there was an old wound asking for attention. He remembered, for instance, a time when he avoided conflict even when something hurt him. Eventually, he realized that this came from the shadow, from a fear of not being understood. When he finally faced that fear, his consciousness expanded. He began setting boundaries, speaking truthfully, standing his ground. The light that emerges when you face your shadow is always brighter. But of course, this process wasn't linear. There were days when he felt illuminated, centered, balanced, and others when the shadow pulled him inward, making old pains echo in his chest. He understood, however, that this oscillation was part of the journey. Depth is never a static place. It is movement, constant learning, accepting that within him coexisted strength and fragility, truth and doubt, light and darkness. And it was precisely this consciousness that made him so human, so empathic, so sensitive to the world. With time, he realized this inner conflict didn't distance him from others. It brought him closer, because by recognizing his own shadows, he developed compassion for the shadows of others. He saw people with more empathy, understood their pain without judgment. And deep down, he felt that this mix of light and shadow prepared him for something even deeper, the feeling that he had always been different, not out of superiority, but because he carried a more sensitive gaze from the very beginning, a sense that now approached him, opening the way for the next revelation. He always carried this silent feeling of being different, a perception so old it seemed to follow him long before he understood the world. It wasn't a sense of superiority, it was depth. Something inside him knew he didn't operate like most people. While others lived distracted, he already noticed invisible nuances, felt pain and truth hidden between the lines. Since childhood, he sensed other people's unconscious as if reading an open book. And even if he couldn't name it at the time, he felt that his essence followed its own path. In school, he noticed things his classmates ignored: the silent suffering of the kid sitting alone, the sparkle in someone's eyes when they were happy for a simple reason, the shadow that appeared when someone lied to fit in. He noticed everything, even when he tried not to. That sharp intuition made him feel out of place, like a visitor in a world that didn't speak the same emotional language. But instead of rejecting that sensitivity, he learned to carry it like an inner lighthouse, guiding him with consciousness. As time went on, this difference became even more evident. In ordinary conversations, his mind automatically went deeper, seeking meaning where others sought distraction. He asked questions no one else asked, saw patterns no one else noticed. Some people found it strange, others admired it, but no one truly understood where that expanded perception came from. He himself took a long time to realize it was part of his essence, a rare sensitivity that allowed him to see the world from the inside, not the outside. There were phases when this difference felt like a burden. He tried to fit in, tried to act normally, tried to feel less, but none of it worked. His consciousness always stretched beyond the limits of the ordinary, and that created a mix of loneliness and clarity. Loneliness because few could accompany him into that depth. Clarity because deep down he knew he would never be like the majority, and that was okay. He had already understood that those who see beyond carry a different perspective, a different way of perceiving truth, a different sensitivity that doesn't fit into traditional molds. And it was precisely this lifelong sense of being different that opened doors to all his inner discoveries. The heightened intuition, the empathy that hurt, the ability to see shadows and lights, all of it came from the same place, from the fact that he had always belonged to the few who feel beyond the surface. And even though that still surprised him sometimes, he started sensing that this difference was not a flaw. It was a sign of who he truly was, and of the deep path that was still unfolding before him. Now that you've recognized each sign, the real question is, what will you do with this sensitivity the world once convinced you to hide? Because noticing what others ignore isn't a burden. It's your greatest strength. And from here on out, you can choose to live aligned with that depth, instead of trying to fit into a superficial world that never matched you in the first place. Think about this. What would your life look like if, starting today, you honored your intuition instead of doubting it? How would your relationships change if you only allowed into your life what respects your essence? And how far could your consciousness expand once you start seeing your shadows as allies instead of enemies? You have something that 99% of people spend their entire lives without discovering: the ability to feel beyond the obvious. So I ask you, are you willing to act like someone who finally understood their own depth? If these words touched you in any way, don't let that slip away. Follow that impulse. Keep learning. Keep knowing yourself. Keep strengthening yourself. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any content that can transform the way you see and feel the world.